This video is about writing Groovy scripts and calling them from RapidMiner using the execute script operator. Now, it doesn't happen very often, but sometimes you have no choice and you have to write some Groovy to implement something special. Of course, it feels wrong and it goes against the main idea behind RapidMiner that writing code is not required. And I always feel there's something dark and sinister associated with having to do it. It isn't dark and sinister, of course, it's just harder. Having said that, as long as the scripts are small, there isn't too much to worry about. So with that in mind, this video, which is the first in a little mini-series, gives a worked example that determines the metadata of an example set and outputs this as an example set in its own right. Apart from seeing how that's done, this can be useful if you have a process that actually requires certain attributes to be present with names and roles to match. So having the metadata as an example set allows these to be checked. The video then goes on to show how to change the names of attributes to match some required metadata provided as another example set, and this can be useful if you have a process you can't change which requires certain named attributes to be present. So we're going to cover very simple things actually. We're going to look at some input data. Then job 1 we'll look at outputting metadata about an example set. And then job 2 we'll change the names of attributes within an example set based on actually another example set that we'll provide. So let's start by looking at a process. Here it is. And we'll start just by looking at some data which I'm making in this sub-process. Let's have a quick look at it. Basically, it's got 5 regular, 5 special attributes. It's just one example, that doesn't matter. And you can see here that there's an ID, a label, a prediction, a cluster, and a weight. And there's a sort of scattering of types: integer, nominal, real, nominal. And then there are 5 regular attributes with helpful names that match the types, one of which is text. And what I'm going to do is run that through this first script here, and rather than look at the script initially, let's just look at the output from this execute script operator. Here's the execute script operator, and you basically define a script in this by clicking this button here. We'll look at this in a minute, but let's just run this operator and see what output we get. So here we are. So here's the original data, here's the metadata for it, and as you now see, there's now a new example set that's been created, which if we flick between the two views of the metadata and the actual example set, we can start to see how they match up. So you can see there's an attribute called name, which corresponds obviously to the name within the original input example set. There's an attribute called role, which is one of the ones here, ID, label, prediction. You can see them here. And there's a type column, which is a number, and I'm guessing that text is of type 5, integers of type 3. There's a 3 there. Let's sort by that column. So those 3 are nominals, and if we look at each of these one by one, we can see that, and so on. So that can be quite useful. Imagine that you had a process where you needed to be sure that you had a label of a certain type and you had a certain number of regular attributes of a certain type. This sort of approach would allow you to check that these things were present. Now let's look at the script and how it's done. So what we do is we click on this edit text button here. Let's enlarge it. Okay, so I've tried to put some comments in as best I can. So basically the script now, it's Java code, but Groovy is a sort of a runtime Java environment. And as we work our way down, let's see if we can explain this. So this first line, in Groovy in Java you need to import a definition of a class. So this is the thing called an ontology, which is needed here in these 3 lines here. So that first line basically means that the thing will compile properly. The second line, this is the input example set. So if I just move this over, we can see there's one input here, And this essentially means that we're setting a variable called example set 0 to be the first input. It starts at 0, but we mean the first one. Then what happens is we're going to create a new example set, and it's going to have 3 attributes in it, and you can see these 3 lines here create new attributes within this thing called attributes, which is a new array of attributes, I guess, and they're of type string. This line seems, obviously I'm not an expert on the innards of RapidMiner, but I think what this does, it creates a memory example with nothing in it, but obviously the attribute names. And then this is a thing called a row factory, which is used to insert or append rows to this example table. So we've got ready with our sort of empty output example set. Now we're going to iterate through the input to work out how to populate the output. So job 1, how many attributes have we got in the input? And this is how you do it. You do all size, and that includes special attributes, quite an important point. So now what we do is we loop through each of the attributes in the input example set, one by one, including the special attributes, which I suspect is what this all does here. And you get the value type, the name, and something about the role of the attribute. A bit of jiggery-pokery here works out if it's a special attribute, else it's regular. And basically what happens is we put those values, name, role, and value type, into this array called values, which is a small string of 3. Sorry, a small array of 3 strings. And then what happens is we make a new row and add that row to our memory set in our example set in memory. And we just, so essentially we go around this, how many attributes there are in the input. Let's say there were 10. This would go around 10 times, and we'd make 10 rows in the output. And then finally, this actually creates the output example set. This row makes an array of 2 example sets that we're going to use as the outputs. So this is how you output multiple outputs from a single Groovy script. So in this case we're going to set the second output to be the result of all of our calculations, and we're simply going to set the first one to be the original example set, and then we're going to return. Okay, so again, if I run that and break at the end of that Groovy script, we can now convince ourselves as to what's happened. So sure enough, we've iterated down this example set to pull out the names and roles and so on, and we've simply filled them in this new example set. Fairly straightforward, actually. So that's good. So we can now start to do something with that output example set. So let's do something. So go back to the process. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to actually manipulate the metadata and implement a new name old name mapping. And I'm going to do that by generating ID, which is a number between 1 and 10, I think it'll be in this case. I'm going to set that ID to be regular. Then I'm going to generate some attributes, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an attribute called old name, which is based on the original name, and a new name attribute, which is based on a constant called attribute, constant string, plus the ID that we're at. So what we'll end up with is an example set with old name and new name as the attributes, and a mapping between the name as was and a new name. And the best thing to do is simply to breakpoint before this Groovy script here and show that. So we'll be able to see the input. So here's the original example set in all its glory. And here is what we're going to do to it. We're going to change these names here to be these names here. Let's see that happen. I'll set a breakpoint after this Groovy script. Might as well clear the before and run it. So now the actual example set has had all the names changed to be attribute 1 to 10 inclusive. And in fact, this is what we did. We actually changed that to that, that to that. And you can see this is the result. And just to prove it wasn't a fluke, I then do some jiggery-pokery with the metadata. And what I do is I basically change it around again so that I can rename it all back. So I do renaming here, a bit more renaming, and then a little bit more renaming. If I set a breakpoint before this second script here, you'll see what will happen. So this time, this is the example set with the names attribute 1 to 10 inclusive, as you can see there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to change attribute 1 back to the original name. So if I just run that, sure enough, it's all come back to the way it was before. So let's have a look at the script that does that. Now these two scripts are identical, rename 1 and rename 2, which is an issue actually, because sometimes you want a library-like approach, and there are techniques to do that, not covered in this video. But let's look at this script here. So what we're seeing is a slightly smaller script, but basically what it does is, first off, you need this import here because I'm using a thing called a hash map. So you need to do this import. I'm connecting the two example sets to different variables. Example set 0 is the 0th, the first one, and example set 1 is the second, starting at 0. And then what we do is we create this thing called a hash map object. This is a way of storing things so you can look them up later. What we do is we loop through all of the examples in the second input. That's quite important. And for each of the examples, we actually put out the name, the new name and old name, for the example and attribute that we know is in this second example set. So it's rather assuming that new name and old name are present in the second example set. And what we then do is we actually put that in this hash map object with old name and new name. Now this works because attributes are unique within an example set. If they weren't unique, this wouldn't work. Now just in passing, you'll see I've commented out this. This is a way of writing some variables or some text to the console. So it's an optional thing. I'll leave it there, just so if you have this script, you can comment that and see what happens. So anyway, the end result of this for loop is a bunch of mappings stored in this hash map between old and new name. Now what we do is we actually then loop through the attributes of the first example set, and we simply get the old name, find out what the new name should be based on that old name that we've looked up with this hash map lookup here, and we simply set the name to be the new name. It's very simple actually. So you essentially set the name here, and then as before we create two example sets and we output two example sets as outputs from the Groovy script, which you can see here. Okay, so that's very straightforward. Let's just for fun, again I'll do the breakpoint before and the breakpoint after. So what you'll see before, you'll see the input. So the input is this example set. This is the named attributes here, and this is what we want to change them to, old name and new name. So if I run that again, just to step through the script, the example set has changed. Sure enough, here they are, and this is essentially the original instruction example set unchanged. And again, if I keep going, it'll all change back again. So that concludes the video. What I'll do is I will just show the Groovy script once for the metadata extraction. Here it is. And I'll show the Groovy script for the renaming operation. There it is.